Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching the video for Lab 1, Unattended Active Directory Installation of benandbrady.com. In this video, we will create our domain, benandbrady.com, and install this domain on the first domain controller, which is DC1. But what we will do is the following. Instead of following the traditional method of actually running the DC promo process on domain controller 1, we will actually create what is known as an answer file to automate this process. So in this particular video, you will learn how to create the answer file. I will go over the different parameters and show you exactly how to configure the answer file. And last but not the least, you will see a live demonstration of the use of this answer file to automate the installation of benandbrady.com. So let's see all that in action. So to begin with, let's review our network so far. We have 4 servers on which we have installed Windows Server 2000. The first of the server we have called it DC1, whose IP address is 200.200.201.1. This particular computer is the one on which we will install the Active Directory to make it the first domain controller of our domain benandbrady.com. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to make a connection to DC1, and this particular computer will be the first domain controller for the benandbrady.com. Ben & Brady Ice Cream Corporation is a company whose network you're going to set up. In fact, this particular company will have 2 different sites, California and North Carolina. And what we are doing is installing the domain controller on the first site, which is California. Now, traditionally, what you would do is the following. You would click on the start button, go to run, and then over here simply type DC promo to start the installation of the Active Directory. This is where you would answer all the questions, and once all the questions have been answered, will the server become a domain controller after it reboots. Now, this is the traditional method. What I'm going to do is exit out of this and show you that there are actually 2 different methods of installing Active Directory. The first method is the Active Directory installation method, and the second one is by using an answer file, which is nothing but a modification of the first method. This is what the answer file does. Typically, when you run DC promo, the Active Directory installation wizard asks you several questions, whether or not, such as whether you're going to create a first domain controller for a new domain, are you creating a new forest, where exactly are you going to install the Active Directory, and so forth. What we need to do is the following. We need to create an answer file, which is nothing but a text file, and then answer those questions in advance. So once those questions are answered in this particular file, then this time when we run the DC promo process, we will tell the process not to ask us questions, but to look for the answers to those questions in the answer file. So let me show you exactly how to do that. Once again, I'm going to minimize this screen and take you to DC1, on which I have prepared an answer file, and this answer file is saved on the C drive. So once again, I'm on DC1 and I'm taking you to the C drive, and over here I've created an answer file. This is a text file called dcinfo.txt. Let me turn on the folder options over here so that you can see the file extensions as well. So hide file extensions, I'm going to turn that feature off so we can actually see the file extensions. Here we go. So I've created a file called dcinfo.txt, and I'm going to take you to this particular file. There we go. So to begin with, what you need to do is the following. Type the first configuration parameter called DC install, exactly the way it is, capital D, capital C, capital I, install in square brackets. This will start the DC installation of the answer file. Now, the first parameter is going to be reboot on success, and I'm just showing you this as an example. I'm going to explain to you each and every parameter. What you do is the following. You type a parameter which is in this case reboot on success, and this parameter has a value. So you separate the parameter and its value by the equal to sign. So reboot on success, which basically means after you have successfully run the DC promo process, do you want to reboot? The answer is either yes or no, and I'm going to say no over here simply so that I can pause the video and show you exactly that the process is done before we can actually start the reboot process. So what you need to understand is the different parameters over here, what they mean and how to configure them. So let's first understand what is contained in this DC info file. So let me take you back to my notes over here and show you what the different parameters are and how you will configure them. Please remember that there are several parameters. I've shown you the ones that are useful to us to create a first domain controller for a new domain and for a new forest. So the very first parameter that we configured over there, as you saw, was reboot on success, and this particular one applies to all different operations. Now let me tell you exactly what I mean by that. Those of you who are familiar with creating domain controllers know that when you can either create a first domain controller on which you are creating a new tree and a new forest, or you may be installing an additional domain controller, which we will do later on DC1, on DC2 and DC3, in which case the domain already exists. So this particular column will tell you exactly whether you need it for all installations or all operations, or only for new trees or new forests. So this particular one you need for all different kinds of operations. Now these parameters are required for all installations. These parameters basically tell the Active Directory installation wizard exactly where to install the Active Directory on the disk. So the first parameter over here is the database path. This parameter tells the answer file exactly where to install the Active Directory on the server. So by default, there is a folder called WinNT created for you. Let me take you to that particular folder. On server, when you install server, you will see that there is a folder called WinNT created for you, and all our files will be installed in this particular folder. So going back over here in this file, I need to configure it. I need to say that please install a database path on the C drive into a folder called WinNT. Same thing with the log path will be on the folder called WinNT, and the sysvol will be on that folder as well. So these three denote the location of the files, and they will all go to the C drive on the folder WinNT. Now depending on the installation that you're doing, for example, let's say that you're installing server on the second partition, and that is labeled as the D drive. And on that particular partition, you've installed Windows Server into a folder called Windows. You have not used the default WinNT folder, but you've used a folder called Windows. In that case, you will modify those accordingly. Then the next thing it's going to ask us is a username and a password for the person who's actually responsible for performing this activity, and will provide that information as well. Also, if you've logged on as the enterprise admin, this is not required. And then the user domain. Actually, our domain is not set up yet, so it will be workgroup in our case. So let me show you how these parameters were configured in our answer file. Once again, the answer file is on the root of the C drive of DC1. So let me take you over there. And I've called the answer file dcinfo.txt. You can of course call it whatever you want. And here we go. Reboot on success equals no, database path. Now instead of calling it the C drive or the D drive, what we do instead is use a variable called %system root %. In other words, what this means is that wherever Windows Server 2000 has been installed, C drive, D drive, go to that particular drive, and over there create a folder called ntds, and in there you should install Active Directory. This is the default folder that is created at the time of the installation of Active Directory. Our log file will also be in the same drive into a folder called ntds, and our sys volume will be in the same drive. Over there it should actually create a folder called sysvol in order to finish the installation. Our username will be administrator, password will be password. So far I've configured the following parameters and shown you exactly how to do that. So let's go back to our notes and see what other parameters need to be configured. The next one is replica or new domain, and the value over here should be domains, meaning that you're actually creating a new domain, not an additional domain controller for an existing domain. So that's a value. Tree or child, you're actually creating a new tree. If you're creating a child domain, you would use the value of child. In our case, we're creating the first domain controller for our forest, so we're going to call it tree. Create or join, once again we're not joining any trees. New domain DNS name. This is the full name that you will use for our domain. In our case, we are going to use the name benandbrady.com. Now it's asking us whether there is DNS on our network, and this one you're going to answer yes or no, and this actually works in conjunction with auto install and config DNS value. So these two parameters work together. Basically what we are saying over here is the following, that if you do not have DNS, I can configure the DNS for you, just let me know. DNS is required for the successful operation and working of the Active Directory. If the Active Directory installation finds that the DNS server is not installed, it will prompt you to actually install a DNS server, and that's exactly what we are saying over here, that check for the DNS server. If it is not there, please go ahead and install it. And I'll show you how to configure these parameters. So these two go together. New domain DNS name, which is benandbrady.com, and the NetBIOS name for the domain go together. The NetBIOS is the backward compatibility name for Windows NT networks. So if our domain name is benandbrady.com, the NetBIOS name should be benandbrady. And the site name is the default name that gives it site. What we have done is I have selected the name called default first site name. So let me show you the configuration of this one more time. Going back to our answer file, this is where we left off. Replica or new domain, tree or child, we're creating a new tree. Do you want to create or join an existing tree? We're going to actually create a new tree. New domain name. This is the name that you will type for your domain. In our case, we have selected the name of benandbrady.com. DNS on network, I've said no over here because I know for a fact that there is no DNS on this particular network. Domain NetBIOS name, I've called it benandbrady.com. Sorry, the NetBIOS name is simply going to be benandbrady, all caps. Allow anonymous access. This is mostly for server 2003, but you can also set it up in server 2000, basically meaning that can a user anonymously access this particular server, and this setting will actually make sure that you have to authenticate to the server before you can log in. Auto config DNS, yes, basically what it is saying is that if you do not find a DNS, and I'm going to say over here, no, there is no DNS, it's going to go ahead and install DNS for us. Make sure that you have inserted the CD-ROM for server 2000 in this computer, because it needs to get the files for DNS in order to successfully install the DNS for us. The site name, this is the site that we will set up, and I'm going to have an extensive discussion of sites, what they are and how they are set up in this video series. We're going to call the first site as the default first site. Safe mode admin password is going to be the word rainbow. This is important. The safe mode administrator's password is the password that you use if you restart your domain controller in the directory services restore mode, so that you can actually restore the database, or rather the Active Directory database, from backup. Once again, this password is not the same as the password on the administrator's account. This is a separate password that you need to provide when you're actually setting up the Active Directory. So once again, you need to create a text file. In our case, I've called the text file dcinfo.txt, and I've saved it in the C drive. The text file, the very first line should be the parameter dc install in square brackets, and then I went over each of these parameters. Each of these parameters is followed by a space, an equal to sign, a space, and the answer for that parameter. So for example, the username who's going to perform this installation is the administrator, password is password, and so forth. All right, and the keywords, the key parameters over here are the domain NetBIOS name, which is benandbrady.com, and the NetBIOS name, which is benandbrady, and whether or not you want to install and configure DNS. So I have answered these questions. Let me make sure that I've saved the file. I've done so. Now I'm going to close this file, or exit out of this, and start a process. So going back to our notes, one more time, you can either run the DC promo manually by typing DC promo, or you can create an answer file and run this. This answer file can also be created, and this particular answer file can be run in conjunction with the answer file if you're actually installing Windows 2000 Server unattended. So if you're installing it unattended, what you can do is you can say reboot, and the first time it reboots, you can run this answer file automatically. So not only have you installed Windows 2000 Server, but also have made it a domain controller at the same time. In our case, we've already installed server, and now we're going to run this answer file. Going to the next screen over here, these were our configuration parameters. Now how are you going to run the answer file? This is how we're going to do it. If you just type DC promo, the Active Directory installation wizard is going to ask you questions, is going to ask you the questions. So you have to provide the answers yourself using the keyboard and the mouse. However, if you put the following parameter with a slash, the keyword is answer over here. So here's the parameter answer colon, and then you have to give it the full path and the file name for the answer file. In our case, it will be c:/dcinfo.txt. So once again, DC promo slash the word answer colon and the location of the file. So let's start this process. So I'm now connected to DC1 and I've logged in as administrator. Now what I'm going to do is click on run and type DC promo slash, and here I've already typed in this before, so I can show you. I typed DC promo slash answer colon c colon, and I'm saying find the answer file over there. Okay, so that's our parameter. Now when I click on the OK button, what should happen is the Active Directory installation wizard should not ask me any questions. It should look up the answers to those questions in this file and simply say that once it is done, it should simply say that I'm going to actually reboot the server. So let's click on the OK button, and here we go. The Active Directory installation wizard is running in the unattended mode. It should take a few minutes. I'm going to keep this video on so that you can observe exactly what takes place. It should not ask us any questions. There we go. It started writing the Active Directory. As you can see that the process is going okay. When it requires the files for a DNS server, it will simply access those files from the CD-ROM if I've inserted. If you've forgotten to insert the CD-ROM, like I was saying before, don't worry about it. The prompt will come up. Simply insert the CD-ROM, click on the OK button, and then you're fine. Now, a lot of administrators, what they do is they use this answer file in conjunction with the setup file that they create for the unattended installation of the server itself. So what they do is the following. They create the unattended text file, and in that text file add this particular section called DC install by creating a configuration parameter called GUI boot once only. In other words, what you're saying is the following, that the first time the server boots up, run the following code, which is nothing but the code in the DC install file. So in this manner, what you've done is automated installation of both Windows 2000 Server as well as the Active Directory itself. So this should take a few minutes. And as soon as this is done, what we would have accomplished would be the following. What we would have done is set up DC1 as the first domain controller for the domain benandbrady.com, which is the domain for our fictitious company, Ben and Brady's Ice Cream Corporation. Now, what I'm going to do next is, when this is successfully installed and rebooted, we will install DC2. I'm sorry, DC2 is already installed. We will install Active Directory on DC2, and this particular time I will not use the answer file. What we will do is install Active Directory on this particular one by running the DC promo process, and in that manner make it an additional domain controller for the benandbrady.com network. And then later on we will go to the third server over here, which is the router, and then configure the server as a router. What we will do is we will join the server to the domain and then configure the server as a router. This has to be done first because I should be able to route packets between DC3 and DC1 and DC2 before I actually make DC3 as a domain controller. Alright, because in order to make DC3 as a domain controller, DC3 has to first contact DC1 in order to copy the domain database from DC1 to DC3. So what we're going to do next is install Active Directory on DC2, configure the router, and make sure that we can ping from DC3 to DC1, and then go ahead and install Active Directory on DC3 as well. So let's check our progress over here on DC1. Let's see how far we are done. There we go. Alright, so we have successfully installed Active Directory, and it's letting us know whether or not we would like to reboot. Now remember, this is asking us simply because we had selected the parameter. Let me take you back to the parameter, reboot on success over here, and we said no. Had we said yes over there, this would have restarted and rebooted automatically. I said no simply so that I can show you that we have successfully installed Active Directory, and now we can start rebooting. So I'm going to say restart now, and we're going to lose our Active Directory connection. In fact, I just lost it. So what I'm going to do is pause this video over here, and then as soon as DC1 restarts, we will take it from there. We will take a little tour of Active Directory on DC1 and then go ahead and install the additional domain controller on DC2. So I'm going to pause the video over here. Well, I'm back, and let's make our connection to DC1 to see if it is up and running now. So here we go. And as you can see, it already created a domain called Ben and Brady. So that's good news. And let's log in. Okay, it's trying to make the connection, and I'm in. Let's verify by going to Active Directory users and computers, just to make sure that our domain is functional. And there we go. Here it is. It set up the domain called benandbrady.com. You should always go to View and then turn on the advanced features so that you can see all the objects. And it created our default objects. And I'm going to give you a tour of this later on once all the servers have been installed into Active Directory. But here's our first server, DC1, installed as a domain controller. So everything is looking good so far. Let's check one more thing before we continue. You should always do this. After you do DC promo, either manually yourself or by running an answer file, always verify that the Active Directory looks good in the Active Directory users and computers. And you should also go to DNS, because DNS is very important for the functioning of the domain. And here we go in DC1. I'm sorry. The DNS on DC1 has created a forward lookup zone called Ben and Brady, and in that zone it has created the first computer object, which is DC1, whose IP address is 200.200.201.1. Eventually all of our servers should register over here. So far so good. And we have successfully created our first domain controller, DC1, using the automated process. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to minimize this screen and then go on to DC2. And once again, it's very important that you check the TCP/IP configuration of this, especially the fact that your DNS is pointed to 200.200.201.1, which is our DNS server for the benandbrady.com domain. So everything looks good over here. You should always check for connectivity by going to the command prompt and then pinging the IP address of the domain controller, which is 200.200.201.1. And here we go, I have connectivity. The reason for this is that we're going to create an additional domain controller on DC2, so it has to contact DC1 in order to get the domain database. And let's see how that can be done. So I'm going to click on the start button. go to run, and then type over here DC promo to start the process of installing Active Directory on Domain Controller 2. All right, welcome to the Active Directory. Next, what am I doing? Creating a new domain or installing an additional domain controller? Well, DC2 is going to be the additional domain controller for benandbrady.com. Click on the next button, username administrator, TRATOR, password is password, and I need the credentials or the permissions of the domain admin or the enterprise admin of benandbrady.com. Hence, it is asking me for the domain name. So the domain name is going to be benandbrady.com. This is the critical step. I'm going to click on the next button. At this point, it is trying to contact the domain so that it wants to know whether DC2 can actually reach DC1 so that it can get the domain database from it. I'm going to click on the next button, and here we go. Remember, these were the parameters that we configured in the answer file. It's going to create the Active Directory database into a folder called NTDS, which will be a subfolder of the WinNT folder that already exists on this computer. Same thing with the log file. Click on the next button. The sysvol folder must be on an NTFS volume, and our volume is formatted as NTFS. Click on the next button, and here's the password for the restore mode. And our password that we chose was rainbow, which is RAINBOW, all lower cases. Okay, click on the next button. Next again, and here we go. So now what you're watching in this graphic is the Active Directory coming from benandbrady.com. In fact, it is physically coming from the server DC1 onto DC2. And as you can see from the graphic, here's a network cable. You will see a little bubble go from here to over here, and once the bubble reaches DC2, you will see that the Active Directory is actually being written to this particular domain controller. So this process will take a few more minutes. I'm going to let this process finish. As soon as this process finishes, server DC2 is going to restart as well, and then we will focus on our attention on the router to make sure that we configure our router as a client of this network. In other words, we're going to join the router on the domain benandbrady.com, and once that is done, we will configure routing and remote access service on it. So what I'm going to do is let this continue and then make our connection over here to our router. So there we go. Here's the router. Once again, to verify that this router has 2 NIC cards, I'm sure you've installed it in the same manner. This server must have 2 NIC cards. This particular NIC card is connected to the first switch on which you have connected DC1 and DC2. This NIC card should be connected to the second switch on which you have connected the server known as DC3. So the IP address of this particular one should be 200.201.254, and the DNS is going to be 201.1. That's great. And let's verify the connectivity over here as well. Let's check the IP address of the second NIC card, which is 202.254. That's great. And now I need to make sure that I can ping DC1 from this as well, because I'm going to join the domain. So what I'm going to do is click on run, go to the command prompt, and then over here, let's try to ping 200.200.201.1, and I'm successfully able to do so. So that's great. Let's close this, and now we will join this server as a client to the benandbrady.com network. To do that, you need to right click on the computer object, go to properties, and in there go to network identification. Here's our computer name, and we have installed it by default as a workgroup computer. I'm going to click on the properties button over here, and then over here we're going to type the name of the domain, which is benandbrady. You can put .com. You can skip that if you want to. NetBIOS names works as fine. Click on the OK button, and now it made a connection to the server. It needs the credentials or the permissions of either the domain admin or the enterprise admin of benandbrady.com. So over here, I'm going to type in the username administrator. Password is password. Please understand this key point. You have to be either a domain admin or an enterprise admin. I'm not typing the username and password of the local administrator of the computer called router, because you need the permission of the benandbrady.com domain's authority to actually join the domain. So this process is taking place independently. Let's check the progress on DC2. And it is still going strong. So let it finish. Let's see which one finishes faster on this server known as the router. Eventually it should give me a message saying that welcome to the benandbrady.com domain. If I were you, I would let DC2 finish completely first before you start this process, just because now DC1 has to do a lot of work. So what I'm going to do is pause the video over here. This may take a few minutes. And as soon as this is done, I'm going to join you one more time. Actually, I don't need to pause the video. Here we go. Welcome to benandbrady.com. On router, click on OK button. And because this is a significant change to this particular server, it's going to reboot. So we're going to say, yes, sure, go ahead and reboot. And I'm going to lose my connection to the router at this point, and it is lost. DC2 is still going strong. This should take a few more minutes. I'm going to pause the video over here. And as soon as this is done, I'm going to join you one more time. There we go. The Active Directory installation wizard just finished on DC2. So again, I'm going to click on the finish button and restart the server. In the meantime, let's take a tour on our first domain controller DC1, and now we can take an extensive tour of Active Directory. Just reposition this window a little bit over here. So now let's go to Active Directory Users and Computers, which is a tool in the admin tools over here. So once again, I'm on DC1 and I'm using Active Directory Users and Computers. And here are the default containers that you must be familiar with. The first container that you should know of is a users container. All the default users are created over here automatically. So in other words, if I were to create my next user, I should go to the users container and then create a user over here. Of course, I can always create OUs and then create a users over there. So here is the default user, the administrator, whose account exists in a container called users. The second container that you should be familiar with is the domain controllers container. This particular one is actually an OU. It's an organizational unit. And as you can see, at this point, it has two computer accounts, DC1 and DC2. This particular OU, or organizational unit, known as domain controllers, actually saves by default the computer accounts of the domain controllers. So once we join DC3 to be an additional domain controller for this domain, you will see the computer account for DC3 over here as well. All right. So this is the one that stores all the computer accounts for domain controllers. In our network, actually, there are three types of computers. You have domain controllers, which are listed under the domain controllers OUs. You have clients that is listed under the computers container over here, and we have one client, the router. And last but not the least, you may have workgroup computers, which are not part of the Active Directory, and they do not have a computer account listed anywhere over here. All right, so just to show you the progress of the network so far, what I'm going to do now is minimize this, and let's see if any of our servers has restarted. Let us first try and connect to the router, simply because this was not a domain controller and should have started faster than the domain controller would. So I'm trying to connect to the router, and here we go. And now if I click on the options button, you will see that I have two different options. I can either log in locally to this computer known as the router, or I can log into the domain. So what I would like to do is actually log into the domain as the administrator. So to enter the password over here. It's going to take a few minutes because it's logging into the domain for the very first time. At this point, it is actually building up its profile. There we go, starting up soon. The difference between a domain controller and the router would be that over here in the router, which is not a domain controller, I should not have. I can if I want to install it, but by default I should not have Active Directory users and computers, simply because I do not have Active Directory on this computer. There we go. Since I'm logging in for the very first time, it's bringing up this configure your server screen, which I'm going to respectfully close over here. And then the second thing to know that this is actually a client of the domain is by right-clicking on the computer object, go to properties, and then over here under network identification, it should say that this is actually a server or a client of the domain benandbrady.com. Here is the full computer name, also known as the FQDN, or the fully qualified domain name, router.benandbrady.com. There we go. And you may have noticed that the color and this computer object changed simply because we are now logged in to the domain benandbrady.com as the administrator, and this is a different profile altogether. So over here I'm going to change this to router, and we are all set. Okay, I'm going to leave the color the way it is. I'm going to minimize this screen, and now let's see if DC2 is up and running as well. There we go. I think it's up. And let's log in. This is a domain controller, and as such it should have the Active Directory on it. In fact, you should be able to see exactly what you were seeing in DC1 on DC2 as well, because the Active Directory is shared and replicated between all the domain controllers of the domain. One of the major things that we'll be doing in this video series is showing you how to actually set the replication so that it is done efficiently between domain controllers, even though they may be geographically apart. So here we go. It's up and running. Now if I go to the admin tools on this computer, I should find the tool Active Directory Users and Computers, simply because I do have Active Directory on this server. And I'm going to close this as well. See if I can quickly close this window before the Active Directory tool installs. I just got lucky. Alright, I'm going to maximize the screen over here a little bit. Reposition this one more time. It's a great idea to actually go to View and click on Advanced Features, simply so that I can see additional tabs as well as folders over here. So here we go, Users folder, and then Domain Controllers. Two of the domains are listed, domain controllers are listed, and in the computers container for the clients, the router is listed. So DC2 is working fine as well. Now, what we need to do next is go to a router and configure that as a router. At this point, we have simply called it a router. Now what we're going to do is install a service known as routing and remote access and actually configure it. So let's make a connection back to the router. And before I do this, actually let me show you this, just so that you understand exactly where we are in our configuration. I'm going to go to DC3, and on DC3, let's try the following that we did before as well. Okay, here we go. I'm going to first try on DC3. I'm trying to ping my router, which is 202.254. This is on the same side of the network, so I should be able to successfully ping that simply because my IP address is in the same network as the other one. So let me type ipconfig. Here we go. My IP is 202.1. The router is also in the same network, so I was able to do so. However, if I try to ping 200.200.201.1, which is a domain controller, I'm still unable to do so simply because the router has not been configured as yet. Okay, so let's configure a router, and then we will see whether or not this particular server can access the domain controller as well. And again, the reason why we have to do that first is simply because this server is on the other side of the network. In fact, it's in a different network altogether, and it will not be able to contact DC1 in order to get the Active Directory from it. So let's make our connection to the router now, and let's configure the service known as routing and remote access. So what I'm going to do is click on Start, Programs, go to Admin Tools, and you will notice that the service routing and remote access is already there. Unlike other services, this service is installed by default. All you have to do is simply configure it. And here we go. Here's a router. And you can see the red arrow pointing downwards. That means it is not configured as a router yet. So we need to do our configuration. In order to configure the server as a router, you right click on it, and then you select Configure and Enable Routing and Remote Access. And now it will start a wizard for me. I simply have to follow the prompts in this wizard to configure this router. Click on the next button. Now there are different choices. What do I need to do? Do I need to set up an internet connection server so that all the clients in this network connect to this particular server to get out? Well, I don't need that. The second option is remote access server. This is just the opposite of this one. Here, your roaming clients or clients that are not in this particular location can actually log in to the server or into the office so that they can access the local area network over here. Telecommuters use this option. No, I do not want to set up a RAS server. This is for dial-in. For VPN to come in through the internet, this is a similar concept known as VPN. I do not want that. All I want to do is route packets between two networks, and that is a selection over here. Network router. This will enable my network to communicate with other networks. So we have two networks, the California network, network 1, and the other network will be North Carolina. And this particular router should be able to route packets between the two networks. So that's the configuration that I want. If you're not happy with any of these predefined settings, you can always click on Manually Configure and configure the server exactly the way you want to route packets. So in our case, network router is good. I'm going to click on the next button, and now it wants to know what protocols will be used. TCP/IP is the protocol of choice. The reason it brings up the screen is that if you're going to use other protocols besides TCP/IP, such as IPX, SPX, or Apple Talk, you need to install those protocols first before you do this step. Otherwise, if you install the protocols later on, you'll have to repeat this as well. So yes, use all the protocols in this list. Do you want to set up demand dial connections? That is to connect to the other router through a phone line. We will not do that. I'm going to click on Next and then click on Finish over here, and that should finish the installation of this router. So this was a very simple process in order to configure the router so that you can access both networks. And as you can see, there's a green arrow pointing upwards. and my router should be good at this point. Since this router is connected to both networks by a direct cable going from the router to each of the switches that the other network belongs to, I do not have to configure anything additional over here. Okay, so I think I'm all set. Let's minimize this and find out exactly if that's true. So here we go. I'm on DC3, and now let's see if I can ping from DC3 to DC1. What we now need to do is go to each of our servers, which is DC1, DC2, and DC3, and make sure that we set up the default gateway correctly. So going to DC3, I'm going to go to the properties, go to the properties of the local area connection over there, TCP/IP properties, and then over here I'm going to set my default gateway as 200.202.254. Of course, I could have done this before also, but I just want to show you systematically as we are adding the services to configure the client as well. So click on OK over here, and I'm done. I should do the same on DC1 and DC2. So on DC1, I will go to the network properties of my local area connection and then go to TCP/IP properties. The default gateway for DC1 should be 200.201.254. Click on OK over here. Okay, close the screen, and now go to DC3 and do the same. Sorry, DC1 I've done, DC3 I've done. Let's go to DC2, and on DC2 let's set up the default gateway as 200.201.254. Okay, I think we are in business. Once again, make sure you set this up correctly. Going back to our diagram over here, for DC1 and DC2, the default gateway will be the IP address in the same network as DC1 and DC2, which is the 201 network. So the default gateway should be 201.254. If you by mistake add 202.254, this server will never be able to get out, as you can see why from here. In order for this particular server or this server to get out of this network to go to another network, what it should do is it should send a packet through this cable, and then on the switch the only other cable that is connected is the one for 201.254. So it will never be able to reach this interface. Because it never reaches this interface, it cannot go to the other interface. That means routing will never work, and then because it cannot reach this interface, you'll never be able to ping this side of the network at all. Okay, so that's the importance of setting up the default gateway correctly. Those of you who have taken the MCSE exams know that most of the troubleshooting questions actually involve setting up the default gateway correctly. Otherwise there's no connectivity, even though all the services are running fine on the servers. So now let's check whether we can actually ping from one server to another. So let's start with DC1. So I'm going to go to DC1, and then over here go to the command prompt, and then let me clear the screen a little bit over here. Okay, now let's try to ping 200.200.200, sorry, 202.1. This would be the IP address of DC3. Okay, I'm going to hit the enter key, and here we go. So we have successfully pinged from DC1 201.1 to the 202.1 network. So here we go. Our network is working fine. I was able to ping from here to here. Since I was able to ping the two ends of the network, the other computer should work fine as well. But let's check it out. Let's go to DC2 at this point, and again go to the command prompt of DC2. Let's minimize this. Let's go to DC2, and on the command prompt for DC2, actually I'm on DC3 now. That's fine. Let's do DC3 first. Remember, before on DC3 I was not able to ping DC1. Let's see if I'm able to do so now. So I'm going to type ping 200.200.201.1, and let's see if I'm able to do so. Very good. So once again, I was able to ping from DC3 to DC1, and now it's time to check out DC2. So let's do that. Here's my DC2, and in there again I will go to the command prompt, and then let's see if I can ping DC3, which is 200.200.202.1, and I'm able to do so. So our router is working fine. Last but not the least, what we need to do is install Active Directory on Domain Controller 3. So let's do that. let's minimize this screen, and now let's go to our domain, the third domain controller, which is DC3. And then once again over here, click on run and then type DC promo. And now as usual, I'm going to run this wizard and then make it an additional domain controller of this domain. Username administrator, password is, let me do this again, and the domain is benandbrady.com. Click on the next button, it will try to contact it. There we go, it found it. Click on OK. Next, next. We'll keep everything to the default, and then the password again over here will be rainbow. Click on next, and then that should that should start the installation of Active Directory. And again, it's going to take a few minutes. I'm going to let this finish offline since I've already shown you how to do this on DC2. And let's go back to our notes over here. So what we've done is the following in this particular video. We actually completed the setup of a lab, and just to show you something new, in this particular video what I did was I showed you the new method of installing Active Directory on DC1, which was the unattended method. I'm sure you already have done DC promo several times, and we followed that method on the other servers. So just for the first domain controller DC1, I showed you a new method known as creating an answer file. And after that, what we did was we finished the setup of this particular network by first making sure that we installed Active Directory on this one. We made this the first domain controller of the domain. Then we installed the additional domain controller on this one. Then what we did was joined router as a client to the benandbrady.com network. Later on, we configured router as a routing device. In other words, we enabled the service routing and remote access on this particular one. Once that was done, we were able to ping the two ends of the network. In fact, all the computers now have connectivity with each other. Then what we did was on DC3, ran the process known as DC promo. Now that DC3 can actually contact DC1, and it can now obtain the Active Directory database from DC1 to DC3. So after the end of this video, if you're following the labs with me, what you should have is 4 servers, 3 domain controllers, 1 client of the benandbrady.com domain. This should be the first domain controller. These 2 should be the additional domain controller, and your router should be able to route packets between these 2 networks. Now we also have 2 networks set up. The first network is the California network, which is 201.0, and the second network, which is connected to switch 2, is the North Carolina network, which is 201.0. So we'll take it from here. At this point, we've set up this only in the Active Directory, meaning that we have just set up the networks 201.0 and 202.0. Later on in the other videos, we will optimize these connections so that our domain controllers can talk to each other in an efficient manner. I thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you very soon in a different video in Active Directory.